Cynic comes from cynos, meaning dog. It's no coincidence that there's cynophilia, which refers to someone who loves dogs. Cynos comes from dogs. I mentioned that Cynicism can be seen as a predecessor to Stoicism. The idea is that nothing which restricts the body fails to benefit the soul in some way. So, they believed that the body should be limited to its most basic needs. So, they owned absolutely nothing. It is said that they walked around dressed in rags. That's why they were called dogs. They walked around in rags and had practically nothing. Diogenes is very famous. It is said that he had only a bowl to drink water from. One day, he saw a child drinking with their hands and immediately threw his bowl away.
I don't even need that.
Exactly. He lived in a barrel, according to what is said.
It was a barrel, right? Is that story with Alexander the Great about him?
Yes, that story with Alexander the Great.
I'll give you whatever you want. Then just step aside a little. You're blocking the sunlight. That's it. Is that a story that what? Is that a story people tell?
Yes, it comes from the anecdotes of that time, as well as the story about him and Aristippus of Cyrene. You must know it, right? No. Aristippus, who belonged to the Cyrenaic school, used to flatter a certain tyrant, and this tyrant would grant him all sorts of benefits. Then, one day, Aristippus walked past Diogenes, who was eating lentils, the most humble food one could eat on this. It was the most basic thing. So Aristippus said to Diogenes, "You know, if you flattered a tyrant, you wouldn't have to eat lentils." And Diogenes replied, "You see, if you ate lentils, you wouldn't have to flatter a tyrant. No."
That's wonderful. So the cynics, why does cynicism exist today? This idea of you. What is the idea of a cynic today? A cynical person, a deceitful person, right? Deceitful, exactly. It completely lost its original context, didn't it?
It has completely lost its context. I wouldn't know at what point in history this happened or why it shifted in that direction.
Do you think, for example, that the Franciscans draw a bit from the cynics? This idea of being detached, of not. Religion also brings a bit of that. You see this in some traditions, right?
Actually, detachment wasn't created by the Cynics, was it? Even in Eastern religious orders, there is detachment. The idea that a person should have the bare minimum materially in order to achieve the maximum spiritually.
So it doesn't originate with them?
That's right, no. It doesn't originate there. This idea of spirituality linked with detachment, is quite common, even in Eastern traditions.
And Stoicism appears. You said it's an offshoot of Cynicism. Why is that? Because they adopt this idea of having just the minimum to live.
But in a somewhat more sensible way, right? They allow for the minimum necessary to live with dignity.
Not so little, really.
Yes, they allow themselves a minimum to live with a certain dignity. But they still hold to this same idea of rigor, which we should also have. A mastery over our impulses, over our urges, over our instincts. An extremely rigorous morality. Exactly.
Related to what? To truth? To being just?
Strictly following values, virtues, not deviating even a millimeter, not acting out of self-interest. In other words, it was a very rigid morality within Stoicism. Teaching through example. You only truly teach when you are what you teach.
And this idea of not suffering over things you can't control, is that part of it too?
Yes, the things that depend on us and the things that do not depend on us, right? There are things that do not depend on us.
Either depends on us or it doesn't.
Exactly just that. Whether it rains or gets cold, whether I catch an illness or not, these are things that do not depend on me. Therefore, I should neither be saddened nor rejoice because of them. Now, my behavior, my response to these things that do not depend on me. Whether I become sad or joyful, whether I remain composed or lose my head, that depends on me. Only my success in what depends on me should be a reason for joy or sadness. My success or my failure.
Perfect. And there are other schools from the same era, Stoicism, Cynicism,
There is Epicureanism.
Epicureanism, hedonism. Hedonism is the opposite, right? Of giving yourself over. Or is it also something that has lost its meaning over time?
The idea of hedonism is almost, let's say, a superlative of Epicureanism.
Oh, really?
Yes, because Epicureanism sought pleasures. But it wasn't quite as we often interpret Epicurus. He sought pleasures that did not cause greater harm, moderate pleasures. Not that thing of drugs and rock and roll. No, pleasures that would not expose us to pain, pleasures that remained within a limit that could keep a person in tranquility. Excessive pleasures, in general, are like a pendulum. When it swings too far to one side, it swings just as far to the other. As well, right? This exposes a person to pain. So, sober pleasures that do not expose a person to risks or pain.
But, for example, like what? Food?
A sober diet, a life that does not require great material possessions. In other words, everything within a measure where the person is not at great risk of loss or suffering. A life based on serenity.
But where's the different hedonism? This idea we have because a person who lives hedonism is someone who lives well, right? The famous, what do you call it? The guy who... The bon vivant, right? Isn't that it?
Hedonism does not find limits for pleasure. For Epicurus, pleasure was something very well defined.
Really?
I recommend, if you haven't read it yet, a very interesting text, which is Epicurus' letter to Menicius. This becomes very clear in it. The criteria for pleasure are set within a certain sober limit that prevents a person from suffering at all. But hedonism has no limits. From this point on, no longer. Hedonism is a life devoted to pleasures, without any boundaries, beyond which we might begin to lose ourselves or take risks. It does not consider the ultimate consequences.